Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my video review of the new Sony FE 85mm F1.4 G Master Mark II lens. Now, the original 85mm G Master lens was actually the OG G Master lens. It was the first that they released back in 2016, and I looked at that lens. I was a little late to the Sony party, so I think it was 2019 when I did my review of that lens a few years later, and I did it as a part of a big comparison with other 85mm lenses. What I found is that it was optically nice, but it was bigger than and heavier than what it needed to be, probably more expensive than what it needed to be, and it had a surprisingly rough focus motor for such a premium lens. Fast forward to 2024, and we have the new Mark II version. And the new 85 GM Mark II, it is smaller, it is lighter, it is faster, and it is sharper, but what it isn't is f1.2. So my question that I'll try to answer as a part of this review in the broader sense is another f1.4 lens going to be enough to stand out from the existing crowd here on Sony? Well, we'll dive into all of that right after a word from our sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by Fantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Fantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out. So let's start by talking about build and handling here. Price tag of this lens is $1,799 US. From what I understand right now, though the final price has not yet been announced. That places it at the same price point as the original G Master lens, but it does place it considerably more expensive than a lens like the Sigma 85mm f1.4 DN lens. It is a smaller and lighter lens than the first generation GM lens. In this case, it is a full 20% lighter and is 13% smaller in terms of its overall internal volume. So its size here, I'll pop off the lens hood so you can get a more sense of the actual size of the lens itself. It is 84.7 millimeters in diameter, retains a 77 millimeter front filter thread. It is 107.3 millimeters in length. And so that is 3.3 by 4.2 inches. The weight here is 642 grams, which is 180 grams less than the predecessor, or 22.7 ounces here. Now, the features have also been updated. While the original GM lens, of course, it was starting Sony's premium Gold Master series, and so as a byproduct of that, it did have more features than what any other lens basically did at that point, at least prime lens. Over the years, of course, obviously the standard has continued to rise. And while GM lenses remain some of the most feature-rich out there, there are a few areas of further improvement that Sony has gone to here. A lot of the features here are actually centered around the control of the aperture iris. So you have an aperture control ring here, and the aperture ring, you have the option of choosing clicks, 1/3 stop to tenths. You can also click a switch on the side, and you can go to a declicked aperture if you want to do aperture racking. There's also an iris lock here, and so the advantage of the iris lock is that particularly if you're doing aperture racking, for example, an iris lock is going to keep you from inadvertently going into either the automatic mode or coming out of the auto mode inadvertently into the manual aperture area. And so if you lock that while you're in the auto mode, if you don't like aperture rings, just lock it in the auto mode and you'll never have to worry about it. If you don't want to inadvertently go into the auto mode, just lock it while you're in the actual manual aperture position, and you'll be able to make sure that you don't inadvertently go into the auto mode. We have an AF/MF switch as before. We have a focus hold / function button, but now rather than having just one of these, we actually have a secondary one at the top of the lens, so you have easy access even if you're shooting in a portrait or a vertical orientation. So adding an extra focus hold button is certainly appreciated there. The manual focus ring itself, it does have a linear focus response, and so that you can be sure that you're going to have repeatability. Again, a lot of these features are designed around video capture, and so a linear manual focus ring can be important for that. I will say that I don't necessarily love the feel here. It is very, very light, and so if you like light, great. I mean, obviously it's not gritty, it moves smoothly, but what it doesn't have is a whole lot of feel to it. And so to me, it doesn't feel like a true manual focus simulation in that sense. It definitely feels focused by wire, in my opinion. The actual aperture iris itself has 11 rounded blades, and as you can see, that helps to keep a circular shape even when the lens is considerably stopped down, here around f4, f5.6, somewhere in that range. We also have a very thorough weather sealing, something that's been a hallmark of the G Master series. So we have a gasket at the lens mount, we have a flooring coating on the front element, and then, although I haven't seen the cutout diagram yet, from what I do know from Sony is that there is internal seals on all of the seal points in the lens itself, on the buttons, on the switches. And so basically everywhere you would expect to see a weather sealing gasket, in the area of vulnerability, there is one inside this lens. It is thoroughly weather sealed. Minimum focus distance here is slightly variable depending on whether you're autofocusing or manually focusing. If you're autofocusing, you can only focus as closely as 85 centimeters. You can get a little bit closer, down to 80 centimeters if you manually focus. Maximum magnification, however, is just 0.12 times, which frankly for an 85mm lens is on the low side of average. And best in the class would be around 0.14 times, and then of course the really bad ones are 0.10 times. And so it's okay, but certainly nothing exceptional or groundbreaking in that regard, though what we do have is really strong up-close performance. So the build is basically exactly what I would expect. It allows it to slot right in alongside the 24mm, 35mm, and 50mm f1.4 lenses and be a very, very nice match for those lenses, I would say, in both size and its feature set. Autofocus, as mentioned previously, was an area of weakness, vulnerability for the first 85 GM lens. And frankly, I was a bit surprised when I did my big comparison back in 2019, and I compared it to other lenses and found, for example, that it was easily outperformed by the much less expensive Sony 85mm f1.8, for example. So the reason for that is that original GM lens had an SSM motor, which essentially was a Sony DSLR focus motor carryover. And it was early days for the transition to mirrorless. And so they were using a lot of the existing autofocus technology that they already had. And so that lens, it suffered for that. And so the focus motor was a little grittier and a little slower than what I anticipated. Sony has made huge strides in autofocus when it comes to their lenses, and frankly, I don't know of any lenses out there where the company is doing a better job in equipping them for high-speed focus. And that's true here. We have dual XD linear motors, and Sony tells me that these are the largest XD linear motors that they've ever produced. And so you've got big, strong motors working in tandem to move that focus group back and forth very quickly. And as you can see here, focus is nice and quick, whether you're shooting indoors or shooting outdoors. And what I felt like in real-world focus changes is that they were pretty near instantaneous. There's basically no focus sound, there's no drama, you just get autofocus. It just does it and makes almost instant changes from one focus point to another. In fact, Sony claims that focus speed is 3 times faster than the original G Master lens, and its ability to track moving subject is improved by as much as 7 times, which tells you that there was an even bigger margin there to be made up for. This new lens has been optimized for the 120 frames per second autofocus on the A9 Mark III, which, in other words, it needs to keep up with the fastest focus possible at this point. And I would say that it does. I was trying to get wait around for ducks to come back in and land at a pond that they were scared off when I came near. And while they never did land while I was around, they did come for some high-speed, low passes. And I was able to not only acquire this duck in flight, but track it flawlessly at f1.4 all throughout this burst. And if we take a look at an individual image and then crop it down, you can see just how accurate focus is, despite having a very complex background. Perhaps even more impressive is I went out near the side of one of my hives and I found that I was actually able to acquire honeybees in flight. And if you know how small and how quickly they are moving, that is extremely impressive. To be able to grab onto one of those and actually focus and have accurate focus, as you can see, our focus is flawless, is very, very impressive. So that means that a little bit easier subject like Nala moving towards me, I was able to do without issue. Even though that is an issue for a lot of other lenses, not only was I able to do that, but in this shot that I'm about to show you, I was actually backpedaling because she wouldn't stay still for me to get into position, holding the camera down and trying to backpedal to get there and taking some shots. They were all flawlessly focused, and you can see in the shot just how amazing the detail is for the conditions in which I acquired the shot. So this is a huge strength now for this lens. I also found on the video side of things that I had zero complaints. You can see here that focus transitions, focus pulls are smooth and confident going back and forth between a subject. Even though the subject is very dark and not high contrast, it was able to grab it and accurately go back and forth there. You can also see that focus breathing is really low, and I could see that even in my earlier focus test. When I compared it, for example, to the Sigma, there's a pretty obvious difference between the amount of focus breathing that is present there. And of course, the GM lens would have the further advantage if you so desired to use Sony's focus breathing compensation if you're shooting on a body so equipped, and you could reduce what little bit of focus breathing is there, you could reduce that even further. I also found when doing my hand test that focus was good and confident in that, making good transitions from my eye to my hand and vice versa, even when fairly quickly moving it back and forth. And so really good confidence there. And then in natural focus transitions, I found that it's not like a really fast and kind of jarring transition from one subject to another, but there's a reasonable amount of damping there to where those focus transitions feel fairly smooth to me. So overall, autofocus is definitely top of the heap. And I was reminded when doing this review that not all that long ago, a lens like, the Canon EF 85mm F1.2, even the Mark II version was fairly glacial in making focus changes. So we are in just whole other areas of progress when it comes to the autofocus performance. So let's talk about image quality. Now I will give you the detailed image breakdown if you're interested at the end of the video here. This new optical design is a little bit more complex. It's moved up from, I believe, 11 elements in 9 groups to 14 elements in 11 groups. We have 2 of kind of the Sony specific extreme aspherical elements here. And then we also have a few extra low dispersion elements as a part of the optical design. Whatever they have done here, this is an incredibly sharp lens all across the frame. So on the technical side of things, it has very low distortion. When I tested for that, I found that I could maybe do a -3 correction of a little bit of pincushion distortion. But frankly, particularly if you're shooting portraits, you might want to leave that uncorrected because a little bit of pincushion distortion tends to be flattering to your subjects. I found also that vignette was very negligible, even at f1.4. I used a +30 to correct, maybe a stop in the corners, but again, something you could leave entirely uncorrected and your images might be better looking for it. I also found that fringing, longitudinal chromatic aberrations were basically perfectly controlled. I saw no fringing either on my test chart or in real-world 3-dimensional objects. Very, very strong ability to control aberrations. As a byproduct, you can also see in this close-up of a flower, for example, in the crop, that micro contrast is amazingly good because we're not losing anything to fringing of any kind. I also found no lateral chromatic aberrations near the edges of the frame, so a very strong performance in all of those areas. So as you might expect, even shooting on a 61 megapixel A7R Mark V, and my results, I examined them at 200% magnification. Basically all across the frame, the results were basically perfect. Great sharpness and contrast in the center of the frame, in the mid frame, and right out into the extreme corners. I found that there is a bit of a contrast boost when stopping down to f2, but basically from f2 through about f8, results are just flawless. And the only reason you would stop down further is to get a little bit more depth of field. So I found that even in fact when shooting landscapes at f1.4, detail held up perfectly. So this is a really, really sharp lens. I did start to see a little tiny bit of softening by f8 due to diffraction. On a high resolution body, it's a little bit more obvious by f11, and as you can see, even more obvious by f16, which is the minimum aperture. All of that is to be expected. It's kind of baked into the cake with the modern high resolution cameras. The bokeh quality is good. In fact, in some situations, it is very good. It's not what I would necessarily call magical. One of the things that happens when you have a really amazingly corrected lens, as this one, is that it's hard to also have really soft and creamy bokeh, because sometimes aberrations actually help in that regard. They hinder in the sharpness area, but they help in the bokeh area. I think that Sony's done a pretty good job here, and that the lens bokeh is very good. I'm not trying to say it's negative at all. It's very good. But I've seen a few 85mm lenses where I felt like just the overall rendering was maybe a little bit more special than what I see from the 85 GM Mark II. That's a taste thing, however, and you may love the bokeh from the images you see here. Another area of pretty flawless performance is when it comes to flare resistance. Now, in this shot at f1.4, the image is overexposed because obviously shooting in bright sun at f1.4 is tough for a camera to do. But as we stop down, we can see that again, there's no flare issues there. Flare resistance is pretty much flawless. And even as I go along and allow little like pops of flare to come through, you're not seeing any kind of ghosting artifacts. It's just really well controlled. This lens optically is pretty amazing. There's not any real flaw that I can point to. So that brings us to the conclusion. I understand the logic of going at f1.4, and clearly they've created an amazing 85mm f1.4 lens. It pairs nicely with the other f1.4 prime lenses in the G Master series. But I will also say that the choice to not go to f1.2 does make it a little bit harder to stand out from the crowd when you have lenses like the Sigma 85mm f1.4 DM that have fairly similar feature sets, fairly similar optical performance, and basically it's only the autofocus that makes the GM stand out from the crowd. And of course, the Sigma is significantly less. You can get it for under $1,100 at the moment, but even at its full MSRP pop, it's under $1,200. And so, you're talking about a pretty serious price premium to move to the GM lens. So the fact that it's only f1.4, I think, is maybe a missed opportunity to stand out from the crowd. The biggest advantage here is that incredibly good autofocus. And so it means that you can get amazing images from the G Master lens, even at the margins, that you might not be able to get with the Sigma, and definitely wouldn't be able to get with a lens like the Samyang, for example. The Samyang has beautiful rendering. Its 85mm f1.4 Series 2 lens is beautiful optically, but autofocus is not quite there. And so that's an area where definitely the Sony distinguishes itself. And at $1,800 US, it's going to cost about $700 more than the Sigma, probably cost you more like $1,000 more than the Samyang. And so frankly, it's worth it if you need the speed. If you don't need the speed, then it's a little bit more debatable. And I don't really have the answer for you. I'll leave that decision up to you. Now, if you want more information, you can check out my full text review that is linked in the description down below. You'll also find linkage to my image gallery from the lens, some buying links there. And if you want even more optical deep dive, stay with me right now and we'll jump into it together. Okay, we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. As you can see here from the left side, completely uncorrected, there's really not a whole lot going on here to correct. So on the right side, you can see a very mild correction, just a tiny bit of pincushion distortion. About a -1, -2 is really sufficient to do that. And then as far as the vignette, it's very mild, and you can see here that using a +30 completely corrects it. So no issues there at all. Very positive results. To give you some perspective with a real-world example, here is the GM lens, and then here is the Sigma. You can see that there is just a huge amount of pincushion distortion by comparison with the Sony lens, which is basically distortion-free, whereas the Sigma has a pretty significant pinch there towards the edges of the frame. We can also see without any kind of electronic correction here that the lateral chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame are basically non-existent. I can't see any fringing in any of these transitions from black to white, so that's flawless there. Likewise, when it comes to longitudinal chromatic aberrations before and after the plane of focus, there's just very little to see here. As you can see, I mean, it's not really hardly any fringing to point to in either direction, so no problem there. And if we look at a real-world image, this would be one where there would be a lot of opportunity for fringing in these very high contrast areas with the light hitting the blossom here. You can see that there is basically no fringing. I see a tiny little bit of green fringing there, but next to nothing. And you can see as a byproduct, the textures just really pop on this image and allows for a tremendous amount of contrast. So that leads us to our look at resolution and contrast. So even if we take a look here at 61 megapixels and 200% magnification, you can see that in the center of the frame, the results are just exceptionally good. I mean, great contrast, great detail. If I go over to the mid frame here, it looks exceptionally good. And if I pan right down into the extreme corner, very, very good. You can see just how much detail is there right off to the very edge of the frame. I rarely see this portion right here resolve so well. I've added these Ansel Adams stamps. As soon as I saw that they were coming out, I knew I wanted these for my test chart. So if we pan across the frame, we can see that there really is basically no difference in the way that these are executed here. Maybe the slightest bit less contrast here at the very corner of the frame, but I mean, it is a very, very similar result I get. And if I go the other direction as well, you can see in similar fashion, we're resolving well right off to the very edge of the frame. So for real world perspective, here is a landscape image at f1.4. It's really impressive to see just how much detail is there. Basically, as far as I can go, you can see right off into this corner where the initial trees are not blocking, that there is resolution right off to the edge of the frame. And not just a little resolution, I mean just a tremendous amount of detail. You can look at the golf carts here, and even the golf carts way off back here, and how nicely they're resolved. And just to give you perspective, remember, this is the image we're looking at. And so those golf carts are, I mean, that's what they're occupying in this frame. You can see the draw distance from up here even out to this lighthouse on a bit of an island. There's just detail everywhere. Very impressive. A closer shot here of Ferrari, and so now we're moving to a medium distance here. You can see how much is just resolved everywhere. I mean, just perfect little pin sharp details and all of the fur around his eye. This image was really impressive to me for a lot of reasons. So you can see just how much micro contrast is there at f1.4. The ability to resolve all of these tiny little textures in here is very impressive. And if we come down here, you can see that, again, this is an opportunity for a lot of fringing, and it's just not there. Very, very impressive results. So if we stop down to f2, which I have here on the right side, you can see that contrast just gets a little bit better. In the center of the frame, we're near perfect, and so it's a fairly mild result there. But for example, if we look over here, you can just see more detail that is executed there. If I pop over to this side, I feel like I can see it even a bit more. I mean, it obviously looks fantastically good here, but you can see that the contrast just pops a little bit more on that side. Likewise, here, we come down here and look at the UK bill here. You can just see just how much fine details are there. Everywhere you look in the frame, it's just really flawless. It's very impressive results no matter where I look. And you can see that it's not a huge difference from f1.4, but there is just that little extra bit of contrast that is there that really makes for a very exceptional end result. So since we're already basically maximizing the sensor here, you're not going to see huge gains from there on. It does look a little bit better at f2.8 than at f2, not by a significant margin, but you can just see a little bit further improvement. Just in some of these contrast and details here, everything is just resolving really beautifully. And already we saw even at f1.4, it resolves pretty much perfectly into the corner. And obviously, I don't really see much here. We've kind of hit the maximum gains possible. So you can really use depth of or aperture really more for depth of field than for trying to improve sharpness in some way. So we can see here that around f5.6 we're going to get the peak on a high resolution body, and while f8 is very close to the same, it is just very, very, very slightly softer in terms of the contrast, and we'll see that carry out more as we stop on down. So by F11, diffraction is going to start to set in a bit more, though it still looks pretty good. And then F16, again, it still looks good, but it is considerably softer than any other aperture value, and that's due to the effects of diffraction. Pretty consistent across the frame that you're just seeing a slight softening effect due to diffraction. So as noted earlier, we really don't have amazing magnification here, 0.12 times, pretty average, but what we can see is this is the area that I focused on, and you can see that there's lots of detail there. And what we can also see here is that the contrast and the detail holds up really well right off to the very edges of the frame here. So a pretty flat plane of focus and very consistently good results. So in the next series of shots, we'll take a look at the way that the detail and contrast plays out with the bokeh quality. And so bokeh here, it looks good, but you can see there's just a little bit of outlining. In this shot, again, it's a little bit more complex. And what you can see is that the detail is mind-blowingly good. And the bokeh is good, though there's definitely some outlining that's there. Now, other times it looks better here. Not absolutely creamy as in the very best lenses here, but you can see that it blurs out a background very nicely. You can see that, you know, the detail is what really stands out to me. It looks exceptionally good. And the bokeh looks good, though I think the detail is the winner here as far as the overall rendering. It's that pops a little bit more than what the bokeh does to my eye. Again, this image looks really, really nice, and so there's nothing here that I'm complaining about. It's more that just my general impression is that I have seen other lenses that have a more, call it magical rendering to it. I think the GM lens does a very good job, but not necessarily an exceptional job with the bokeh region. Moving back into what is exceptional, however, is we're going to see that for a large aperture prime lens, we really do a great job when shooting into the sun. Now, I had to try to recover this a little bit because we were exceeding the shutter limit of the camera due to f1.4 and shooting into the sun. But we can see here as we stop it down, you get a little bit of this effect that's kind of naturally there in the clouds, but we're seeing a very, very strong looking end result. Likewise, in this shot here, and you've seen previously on the video of this, that even as we're popping through and allowing the sun to shoot through, there's very, very little ghosting artifacts that are present. It really does quite an amazing job there. So, I mean, outside of a little bit of quibbling over the quality of the background blur, I would say this lens is pretty exceptional. So thanks for sticking around to the very end, and hopefully the optical deep dive has given you an even better sense of the overall performance from the lens and helped you to make a more informed buying decision. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.